Imagine a fleet of 60-foot warships carved from ancient giants appearing out of the Pacific mist. They carried warriors in wooden armor who ruled a maritime empire stretching 1,000 miles, long before a single European sail ever touched these shores. While the rest of the world looked away, this nation turned the violent sea into their highway and the forest into their throne. They were the architects of the ocean, the lords of the rainforest, and the most feared naval force in North American history. They were the Haida. Welcome to the Past in Focus, where we unearth the world's most incredible lost civilizations. If you love deep dives into the mysteries of our history, make sure to subscribe. Today, we bring a forgotten empire back into the light as we uncover the secrets of the masters of the sea. To understand the rise of this naval superpower, we must look to their home, Haida Gwaii. This is a mist-shrouded archipelago sitting off the coast of modern-day British Columbia and Alaska. To early explorers, these islands were a nightmare of jagged rocks and lethal currents, a place known as the graveyard of the Pacific. But to the Haida, this was an impregnable fortress. In this corner of the world, nature wasn't just something to be survived, it was something to be commanded. While empires in Europe were navigating the complexities of the Middle Ages, the Haida were perfecting a maritime hegemony that remains unparalleled. They were more than a tribe, they were a sovereign naval power. Their influence was so vast that modern historians call them the Vikings of the Pacific. Much like the Norsemen, the Haida used their isolation as a strength. The rugged terrain forced them to look toward the horizon. They realized early on that if they could conquer the waves, they could control the coast. This environment forged a people who were not only physically resilient, but possessed an engineering mind that was centuries ahead of its time. The sea provided their wealth, but it was their ingenuity that protected it. Every great empire is built on a specific technological edge. For the Romans, it was their roads. For the Haida, it was the western red cedar. They called it the Tree of Life, a spirit that provided everything from their clothes to their homes. But the ultimate expression of their power was the Haida war canoe. Imagine a vessel 60 to 70 feet long, carved from a single trunk. These were not just boats, they were master-level naval architecture. A master carver would select a tree that had been growing for 700 years, using only fire and stone tools to hollow out the massive trunk. But the secret that continues to baffle modern engineers was a process called steaming. The carvers would fill the hollowed hull with water and drop in red-hot volcanic stones until the water reached a rolling boil. The rising steam would soften the ancient wood, making it supple. At the precise moment, the carvers would wedge large wooden struts into the hull, stretching and widening it beyond the tree's original diameter. This created a flared V-shaped hull, incredibly stable in high seas and fast enough to outrun almost anything on the water. These warships could carry 5 tons of cargo or 50 armed warriors across the open ocean. They were the Ferraris of the ancient Pacific, allowing the Haida to strike with surgical precision across thousands of miles of coastline. With these ships, the Haida became the ultimate harvesters of the coast. In their world, power was not measured in gold, but in prestige, slaves, and copper. And the Haida were experts at taking all three. Their raids were legendary, appearing out of the morning fog, their black-painted hulls slicing through the water in total silence. But they were not just raiders, they were professional military class. A Haida warrior was a sight of pure terror. They wore slat armor, sophisticated vests made of interlocking hardwood rods that could deflect arrows and even early European musket balls. Their helmets were massive, carved into the likeness of predatory spirits like bears, eagles, and sea monsters. When a Haida war party landed, they engaged in a psychological assault. They were tactical geniuses, using the tides and the weather to launch amphibious attacks that decimated their rivals. From the Aleutian Islands down to the shores of Washington State, the name Haida became synonymous with a maritime superpower that could not be challenged. They dictated who could pass through the inner waters, and they controlled the trade routes with an iron grip. What allowed this warrior society to thrive was a biological miracle. The cold waters of the Pacific were a supermarket. The salmon runs were so thick that it was said you could walk across the rivers on their backs. Halibut the size of barn doors were pulled from the depths daily. This incredible abundance gave the Haida something few other ancient peoples had: leisure time. Because they could harvest a year's worth of food in just a few months, they had the time to dedicate themselves to high art, complex politics, and deep philosophy. This wealth allowed for a social hierarchy as complex as any European monarchy. Every seat in their massive cedar longhouses was assigned by rank. Every beam told a story of ancestry and power. This was a civilization that had moved beyond mere survival and into the realm of high culture. But the Haida's true legacy was not just written in the blood of their enemies. It was carved into the very soul of the forest. Beneath the warrior's armor lay a culture obsessed with the supernatural, a world where animals were gods and trees held the memories of the dead. As they returned from the sea to their quiet villages, their weapons of war were replaced by tools of creation, giving rise to monuments that would stand as a testament to their spirit for centuries to come. While the Haida were masters of the sea, their true identity was rooted deep within the silent shadows of the cedar forests. To an outsider, they were fearsome raiders, but to the Haida themselves, they were a people living in a world where the line between the physical and the supernatural didn't exist. They believed that every tree, every rock, and every animal possessed a soul, and that the forest was a living library of their ancestors' memories. As the warriors returned from their long voyages, they stepped out of their black canoes and into a world of complex rituals and towering monuments. They were about to turn the raw power of the Pacific into a cultural legacy that would outlast their empire of war. If you were to approach a Haida village 1,000 years ago, the first thing you would see would not be the people, but the giants. Standing 50, 60 feet tall along the shoreline were the totem poles. To the untrained eye, these looked like religious idols or abstract art, but in the world of the Haida, they were much more. They were legal documents, family crests, and historical archives carved into the heart of a tree. The Haida had no written language, yet their history was perfectly preserved. A totem pole was a declaration of status. When a chief raised a pole, he was telling the world, "This is who I am, this is where my family comes from, and these are the rights I have earned." Each figure on the pole, the bear, the whale, the eagle, the wolf, represented a specific lineage and a story from the dawn of time. There were different types of poles for different purposes. Some were house frontal poles, serving as grand entrances to their massive cedar homes. Others were mortuary poles, holding the remains of great leaders, their spirits watching over the living. But the most prestigious were the memorial poles, raised to honor a fallen chief. Carving these was a task of immense precision. A master carver would spend months, sometimes years, perfecting a single pole. They didn't just carve wood, they captured the soul of a family. When a pole was finally raised, it was a moment of supreme national pride, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. To understand why these carvings mattered so much, you have to understand the rigid structure of Haida society. The entire nation was divided into two grand lineages, the raven and the eagle. This wasn't just a simple club or team, it was the very foundation of their existence. A person was born into their mother's lineage, a system known as matrilineal descent. If your mother was a raven, you were a raven. You belonged to her house, you inherited her crests, and you were bound by her laws. But there was a catch that kept the nation unified. A raven could never marry another raven. An eagle could never marry an eagle.
This meant that every family was a fusion of both sides. It created a web of kinship that stretched across every island. If one village was attacked, their relatives in the next village, bound by these marriage ties, would rise to defend them. At the center of this mythology was the raven, the most complex figure in Haida belief. He wasn't a god in the traditional sense, he was a trickster. According to Haida legend, it was the raven who discovered the first humans hiding in a giant clamshell on the beach. It was the raven who stole the sun from a hidden box and gave light to the world. He was mischievous, often greedy, and sometimes foolish, but he was the catalyst for all creation. By identifying as ravens or eagles, the Haida weren't just naming themselves, they were placing themselves inside a living myth. While the totems showed their history, there was one ritual that defined their future, the potlatch. In the modern Western world, we measure power by how much wealth we can accumulate. In the Haida world, power was measured by how much wealth you could give away. A potlatch was a massive, multi-day festival hosted by a high-ranking chief. He would invite rival clans and neighboring villages for a feast of epic proportions. But the climax of the event was the distribution of wealth. The chief would give away thousands of hand-woven blankets, intricately carved boxes, and precious sheets of copper. In some cases, to show absolute dominance, a chief would even destroy his most valuable possessions, burning them or throwing them into the sea, just to prove that his wealth was so vast that its loss meant nothing to him. This wasn't just a party, it was a high-stakes political game. By giving a rival a massive gift, you were essentially shaming them. They were now in your debt. They could only regain their honor by hosting their own potlatch and giving back even more. This cycle of giving and receiving acted as a social safety net, redistributing wealth throughout the community and preventing any one person from becoming a tyrant without serving the people. It was a system of social engineering that kept the Haida stable, wealthy, and culturally vibrant for thousands of years. For millennia, this balance of war, art, and ritual made the Haida the undisputed masters of the North Pacific. They had built a world of cedar and spirit that seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. But as the 18th century drew to a close, a new sound began to echo across the water. The sound of heavy iron anchors and the voices of men from a world the Haida had never have imagined. The Iron Coast was about to meet the Age of Iron, and the collision would be more devastating than any war they had ever fought.
For over 10,000 years, the horizon of the North Pacific belonged to the Haida. Their black-painted war canoes were the only giants on these waters. But in the late 1700s, a new shape appeared through the coastal mist. Massive, white-winged ships made of oak and iron, carrying men who spoke a language as cold as the steel they carried. The Haida didn't look at these strangers with fear. They looked at them with the eyes of masters. They saw a new opportunity for trade, for wealth, and for power. But they could not have known that within these grand sailing ships lay an invisible passenger, a silent killer that would do what no rival nation had ever achieved. It would bring the Vikings of the Pacific to the very brink of extinction. The first major encounter occurred in 1774 with the Spanish, followed quickly by the British under Captain George Dixon in 1787. These explorers were searching for the Northwest Passage, but what they found on Haida Gwaii was something far more valuable, the sea otter. To the Europeans and Americans, sea otter pelts were soft gold. In the markets of Canton, China, a single pelt could fetch a small fortune. The Haida, being shrewd businessmen and expert hunters, immediately dominated this trade. They didn't just trade with the Europeans, they dictated the terms. While other indigenous groups were often exploited, the Haida were too powerful to be bullied. They demanded iron, cloth, and most importantly, firearms. This influx of wealth created an unprecedented golden age of art on the islands. With new iron tools, Haida carvers could create larger, more intricate totem poles than ever before. This is the great irony of Haida history. The very tools and trade that brought their culture to its artistic peak were the same forces that began its destruction. As the Haida grew wealthier, the nature of their warfare changed. Armed with European muskets, their raids became even lethal. The balance of power on the coast shifted violently. But the fur trade was a double-edged sword. To keep the wealth flowing, the sea otter was hunted almost to extinction. And as the otters vanished, the Europeans began to bring something else to the islands, something far more permanent than iron. Settlers, missionaries, and the ideologies of a distant world. By the mid-1800s, the maritime fur trade was dying, but a new and terrifying threat was taking its place. The Europeans brought with them diseases to which the Haida had no natural immunity. Measles, typhoid, and respiratory infections swept through the longhouses. But the most devastating was the variola virus, smallpox. The Great Smallpox Epidemic of 1862 was not just a biological disaster, it was a cultural apocalypse. It didn't strike the Haida on the battlefield, it struck them in their homes, during their feasts, and in their sleep. In the crowded, communal living of the cedar longhouses, the virus spread like wildfire. A civilization that once boasted a population of nearly 30,000 people was decimated in a matter of months. Imagine the horror. Villages that had stood for millennia were suddenly silenced. The master carvers, the keepers of oral history, the chiefs who held the laws, they were all dying. In less than a year, nearly 90% of the Haida population was wiped out. By the time the fever broke, fewer than 600 Haida remained on the islands. The Vikings of the Pacific had been silenced not by cannons, but by a microscopic enemy. The grand villages were abandoned, leaving the towering totem poles to rot and lean in the rain, standing as wooden tombstones over empty beaches. As the population collapsed, the Canadian government and religious missionaries moved in to fill the void. They saw the surviving Haida not as a fallen superpower, but as a dying race that needed to be civilized. What followed was a systematic attempt to erase the Haida soul. In 1884, the Canadian government passed a law that struck at the very heart of their society, the Potlatch ban. The ritual that defined Haida law, wealth, and history was now a criminal act. Missionaries saw the totem poles as heathen idols and encouraged their destruction. But perhaps the most painful blow was the residential school system. Haida children were forcibly removed from their families and taken to distant schools where they were punished for speaking their language or even mentioning their ancestors. For nearly a century, the great silence deepened. The songs were hidden, the dances were practiced in secret, and the language began to flicker like a candle in a storm. To the outside world, it appeared the Haida were gone, a tragic footnote in the history of the North Pacific. The cedar forests began to reclaim the ruins of the great longhouses, and the carvings of the raven and the eagle were bleached white by the salt air and the sun. But the Europeans made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the resilience of the cedar spirit. Deep in the hearts of those few hundred survivors, the stories didn't die. The law of the potlatch was whispered in the dark. The designs of the carvers were memorized by children who refused to forget. The Iron Coast was battered, broken, and silent, but it was not dead.
The roots of the life tree ran deeper than any law could reach.
By the early 20th century, the world had written the obituary of the Haida people. Their population had plummeted from 30,000 to a mere 600 survivors. Their grand longhouses had collapsed into the forest floor, and their sacred potlatch was a crime under colonial law. To the historians of the time, the Haida were a vanishing race, a ghost of a maritime empire that would soon be forgotten. But history is not just written by the victors, it is carried in the blood of the survivors. From the quiet corners of hidden cabins and the hushed whispers of elders, a spark remained. The Iron Coast was not preparing for a funeral, it was waiting for a rebirth. This is the story of how the raven found its voice again. As the 20th century progressed, the threat to the Haida shifted from disease to industry. Industrial logging began to strip the islands of their ancient cedars, the very trees that were the backbone of Haida culture and spirit. For decades, the Haida watched as 500-year-old giants were loaded onto trucks and shipped away. But in the 1970s and 80s, the silence finally broke. The Haida did something the world didn't expect. They stood up. In 1985, at a place called Lyo Island, Haida elders clad in traditional regalia stood on the logging roads, blocking the massive trucks. They were arrested, one by one, elderly grandmothers and war veterans being led away by police. These images flashed across television screens across the globe. The Vikings of the Pacific were back, but this time their battlefield was the legal system and the court of public opinion. This was more than an environmental protest. It was a stand for sovereignty. The Haida argued that they had never ceded their land, never signed a treaty, and never given up their right to protect the Tree of Life. Their resilience led to a landmark victory, the creation of Gwaii, a national park reserve co-managed by the Haida Nation and the Canadian government. For the first time in over a century, the Haida had reclaimed the right to protect their ancestral home. The era of being managed by outsiders was over. They were once again the stewards of the archipelago. While the battle for the land was being fought in the forests, a cultural revolution was taking place in the workshops. For decades, the art of the totem pole had been nearly lost, but a new generation of artists, led by visionaries like Bill Reed and Robert Davidson, began to study the old poles in museums, tracing the lines carved by their ancestors. In 1969, for the first time in nearly a century, a totem pole was raised in the village of Masset. It was a moment of profound emotional release. Thousands of people gathered, many of them in tears, as the raven and the eagle once again looked out over the Pacific.